The grand ballroom shimmered beneath 1,000 flickering chandeliers, each crystal prism scattering fractured light across gilded mirrors and polished parquet floors. The air was thick with the scent of roses, perfume, and the faint tang of candle wax, mingling with the nervous breath of noblewomen adjusting corsets and the rustle of silk gowns sweeping past one another. The chatter was a soft hum of civility, undercut with a sharp edge of whispered gossip, the invisible currency of this gilded cage. At the far end, the orchestra strings wept a tender, lilting melody that made the dancers sway as though pulled by invisible strings, and in that measured sway, the Duchess felt herself suspended between dread and desire. She entered through the double doors, her posture impeccable, shoulders squared beneath the weight of her society's scrutiny. Her gown, a cascade of sapphire silk embroidered with silver threads that caught the light in delicate sparks, clung to her form and flowed behind her like a river of starlight. Every detail had been meticulously chosen. The jeweled comb in her hair, the lace edging of her gloves, the faint blush upon her cheeks. Yet even in this perfection, she felt the hollow tug of her own vulnerability. She was a spectacle, yes, but for what? A union born of appearances, not passion, and the whispers of her peers were like tiny knives, invisible but keenly felt. The Duke, her husband in title and little else, stood near the raised dais, his back straight, one gloved hand resting lightly on the balustrade. His coat, black as midnight, was impeccably tailored, his posture the very image of composed authority. Yet there was a chill in the angle of his jaw, a deliberate distance in the tilt of his gaze that sent a shiver down her spine. He acknowledged her entrance with nothing more than a slight nod, an action that spoke of courtly etiquette but concealed the sharpness of disinterest, or worse, disdain. The Duchess's chest tightened as she caught the flicker of amusement that danced across his dark eyes, a silent jest at her expense meant only for those who dared to watch too closely. Whispers rippled like water over pebbles. "She's exquisite," murmured one matron, "but ever so stiff." One wonders if the Duke truly sees her, or merely tolerates her display. Another voice, lower, edged with malice. "I hear the Countess of Redcliffe predicted she would wilt beneath the scrutiny. Mark my words, she will crumble by the evening." The Duchess felt the weight of every syllable like a hand pressing against her sternum, each rumor a small fracture in the carefully constructed mask she wore. She lifted her chin, forced her lips into a demure smile, and moved with the careful grace of one trained to survive in this world where even a misstep, literal or figurative, could be fatal to reputation. A servant approached, whispering in the Duchess's ear, a folded note of no consequence to any but her own torment. A social errand she had forgotten, a trivial mistake magnified in the imagination of the ballroom's inhabitants. She accepted it with the practiced ease of one accustomed to hiding her agitation behind a mask of composure, but inside, a storm swirled. Each step she took toward the center of the room felt heavier than the last, as if gravity itself conspired to remind her that she was both spectator and spectacle, trapped in a dance choreographed by others' expectations. Then it happened. A misstep, a slight stumble on the silk-slicked floor, barely perceptible to anyone not observing with the keenest eye. A foot caught in the edge of her gown, a faint rustle, a breath of sound. Yet the effect was instantaneous. Eyes turned. Murmurs sharpened into audible notes of surprise and sympathy, some sincere, others edged with barely concealed derision. The orchestra faltered for a beat, the music hiccuping as if embarrassed by her error. She felt heat rise to her cheeks, a tide of shame that no composure could repel. The Duke's gaze fell upon her, dark and assessing. There was no mercy there, only the cold clarity of judgment. And in that glance, she read the unspoken truth she had long feared. In this union of appearances, she was already failing. The ballroom seemed to tilt, the chandeliers swinging with exaggerated motion in her mind, and every whispered commentary echoed as a verdict. She straightened, forcing herself upright, smoothing the skirts of her gown, yet the tremor in her hands betrayed the turmoil within. She had entered this room with hope, however faint, that the evening might pass with some grace, yet it was immediately stripped away, replaced by a raw, aching vulnerability. A hand brushed against her elbow, not gentle, not familiar, but precise and deliberate. The Duke had moved closer, circling her with the slow, deliberate motion of a predator, his lips curving in a polite smile that did not reach his eyes. "My dear," he said, voice low and measured, carrying both the weight of command and a subtle sting, "perhaps next time you shall practice your steps before presenting yourself to society." The words were civil, almost courteous, yet she felt them like a lash, a public chastisement veiled in formality. Around them, conversation resumed, but she was acutely aware of the shift in the room's energy, the subtle alignment of eyes that now measured her every gesture. She retreated toward the fringe of the dance floor, heart hammering, seeking refuge in the shadows near the gilded walls. A small vase of roses caught her attention, the petals trembling under the flicker of candlelight. She allowed herself a brief, trembling breath, fingers brushing the blooms, trying to anchor herself in something living, something soft and unjudging. And yet, even here, the sting of public humiliation clung to her. Every whispered, "She is so young, and yet so fragile," and every glance that flicked toward the Duke reinforced the central truth she could no longer ignore. Her marriage was a performance, and she had failed the opening act. The Duchess's mind raced, weaving through a tapestry of fear, longing, and sudden resolve. She would endure this night, as she had endured every scrutiny before, but she would not collapse entirely. There was dignity yet to be reclaimed, small victories to carve from the relentless judgment of society. Still, the ache in her chest, the bitter awareness that the man she had once admired, perhaps even loved, could wield such silent cruelty, was a revelation she could neither soften nor escape. And then, as the music swelled into a tender, lilting refrain, she caught sight of him again. The Duke, standing at the edge of the dance floor, his eyes holding her with an intensity that made the air between them taut, unreadable. Was it a challenge? Mockery? Or something buried, something unspoken that might yet bend the rigid lattice of their connection? The room seemed to hold its breath alongside her. A single heartbeat passed, and in that heartbeat, the Duchess understood the cruel truth that would shadow every step she took tonight. Appearances had been the architect of her marriage, and betrayal, the Duke's subtle, inescapable betrayal, was already the cornerstone of their shared world. She lifted her chin again, smoothing her gown with deliberate care, and prepared herself to meet the night as she always had, with grace, with silence, with a heart bracing against the storm. Yet as she stepped forward, the faintest quiver in her hand betraying the fragile core beneath her composure, she could not escape the singular, suffocating certainty that nothing in this ballroom, or in the gilded world outside, would ever feel safe again. And in that moment, just as the Duke's shadow fell across her path, the music swelled and paused, as if the world itself had inhaled, leaving her suspended on the precipice of humiliation and revelation, the first note of a tragedy only just beginning to play. The night had deepened, yet the ballroom's brilliance refused to wane. Candlelight shimmered like captive stars across mirrored walls, casting reflections of gowns and coats in subtle duplicity. Laughter and the soft scraping of polished shoes across the floor wove a delicate, deceptive symphony of civility, masking the currents of envy and intrigue that rippled through the assembly. The Duchess, though still trembling from the sting of her earlier humiliation, held herself with careful dignity. She traced her gloved fingers along the edge of her fan, pretending to admire the delicate lace while listening to the sotto voce murmurs that brushed her ears like winter wind. It was then that a servant approached, bearing a small, exquisitely wrapped box. No announcement, no flourish, just a muted presentation that drew the Duchess's gaze. Her pulse quickened. The package was delicate, tied with a silver ribbon that caught the chandelier's light in tiny sparks. The note pinned atop it bore the Duke's handwriting, precise, controlled, yet unmistakably personal. With a cautious breath, she unfolded it, revealing words that balanced dangerously between warmth and irony. "For your attention, my dear. Perhaps it will remind you that even in error, one can find beauty." Her fingers trembled slightly as she lifted the lid. Inside lay a delicate brooch, a filigree of silver entwined with tiny sapphires, the color of her gown, its craftsmanship so intricate it seemed to pulse with a secret life of its own. The gesture was a paradox. Tender in appearance, yet beneath the surface, she felt the weight of its implications. The Duke's attentions were never simple. They were tests, challenges, traps wrapped in gilded offerings. A thrill of fear mingled with the faintest flutter of hope. Could this be an olive branch, or yet another carefully measured manipulation? The room, however, did not pause for contemplation. Eyes lingered, mouths whispered, and the subtle machinery of scandal began its quiet work. One of the more ambitious debutantes, a creature of sharp angles and sharper gossip, had noticed the exchange. Her eyes, bright with calculated curiosity, flitted toward the matronly arbiters of propriety, who leaned in, nodding as though interpreting a secret message hidden in the Duchess's small smile. The Duchess's chest constricted. Every small gesture, every borrowed moment of attention, could be twisted into fodder for ridicule. A misread glance, a perceived familiarity, a present received, it all became currency in this merciless economy of reputation. Yet the Duchess's mind could not linger solely on fear. The brooch rested in her palm like a heartbeat, and in its quiet weight, she felt the faintest flicker of something she had long denied: possibility. In the quiet of her inner thoughts, she allowed herself a private wonder. Perhaps the Duke, enigmatic and unyielding as he was, carried within him a kernel of genuine affection. Perhaps behind the austere mask of his manners and social calculation, there existed tenderness reserved only for her. The thought was dangerous, almost reckless, yet irresistible. The orchestra struck up a new waltz, and the ballroom's energy shifted like a living thing. Couples glided across the floor in practiced perfection, their movements precise yet deceptively effortless. The Duchess lingered near the periphery, observing, noting, her eyes catching the subtle exchanges of other pairings, the fleeting hand on an elbow, the whispered word, the silent understanding between those who had long mastered the dance of hidden desire. And there, in a brief, tremulous moment, she glimpsed her own reflection in a gilded mirror, poised, beautiful, yet somehow fragmented by the memory of earlier humiliation. The Duke approached, each step measured, a predator moving among flowers that dared to bloom too brightly. His gaze lingered on her, assessing, unreadable. Without a word, he extended a gloved hand, a silent invitation. The murmurs rose again, low but insistent, the ballroom alive with speculation. She hesitated. Society demanded obedience, caution, a careful calibration of exposure. Yet the brush of his fingers against hers, the slight pressure of his grip, stirred something long dormant. In that contact, the Duchess felt both a thrill of connection and the icy edge of fear. A sudden ripple of scandal broke the delicate air. A note, dropped by an inattentive page, fluttered to the floor between them. It bore the unmistakable seal of a rival matron, one whose influence and envy were matched only by her cunning. The message, read aloud in the softest whispers by those standing near, implied impropriety, a misinterpreted glance, a comment misconstrued, the suggestion that the Duchess had somehow ensnared the Duke's attention inappropriately. The room froze for the tiniest heartbeat, the insinuation hanging like smoke above a fire. Every head turned subtly, every gaze measured and appraising. The Duchess's pulse surged, her heart beating a rapid rhythm of panic and indignation. The Duke's hand remained firm on hers, his touch a paradoxical comfort and condemnation. "Ignore them," he murmured, his voice low, resonant, carrying the weight of command and subtle intimacy. "Let the whispers dissolve into the air from which they came." And yet, even as his words soothed, the knowledge of their impact remained. Society would interpret her every move, her every smile, her every gesture, through a lens she could not control. The brooch glinted once more in the soft candlelight, a silent witness to this unfolding drama. Its sapphires caught the gaze of those who might have used it as evidence, while its private significance, a token of attention, perhaps even affection, remained hidden beneath the polished surface. The Duchess pressed it to her heart, a quiet rebellion against the merciless scrutiny surrounding her. In that small act, she reclaimed a fragment of agency, a spark of dignity in a world determined to strip it away. Hours passed, measured by the slow progression of dancers across the floor and the subtle shifting of conversation from idle gossip to strategic observation. The Duchess felt herself drawn into a precarious equilibrium. She would navigate this night with the careful grace of one balancing on a knife's edge, her every step a calculated act of survival. And yet, beneath that discipline, an undercurrent of anticipation stirred, a question she had not allowed herself to ponder fully. Could the Duke, inscrutable, measured, and often cruel, also harbor a secret allegiance of the heart? It was in a fleeting instant, as the orchestra's violins rose to a soaring passage, that the Duke leaned closer, his breath brushing her ear. The words, whispered, were meant only for her. "There are depths here you have yet to see, my dear. And whether you will rise or fall depends upon your own courage." The statement was as cryptic as it was intimate, a spark of tension that ignited the air around them. She felt a tremor of fear, a surge of longing, and a fragile thread of hope all at once. The Duchess's eyes met his, searching, questioning, and for the briefest heartbeat, she thought she glimpsed vulnerability beneath the mask of cold command. The ballroom, with its polished floors and gleaming chandeliers, became a distant backdrop to the private storm between them. Every whisper, every glance, every subtle gesture coalesced into a single piercing truth: the evening had shifted. The delicate equilibrium of appearances, of control, of social expectation, was no longer static. Something had moved, something dangerous, something exhilarating, something that might very well change everything. And as the Duke's hand lingered, the brooch pressed to her chest, and the soft swell of music filled the room, the Duchess understood that the night was far from over, and that the first threads of scandal, passion, and peril were already entwining her fate. The next step, she realized, would demand courage, and in that moment, with eyes locked and the world watching, she felt both the thrill and the terror of what was yet to come. Rain tapped softly against the tall, mullioned windows of the Duke's private library, a delicate percussion that seemed to echo the Duchess's anxious heartbeat. The room smelled of aged oak and flickering candle wax, a combination at once comforting and oppressive, like a memory one cannot quite place. Shadows danced along the walls, thrown by the wavering light of a solitary fireplace, elongating the furniture into the strange and intimate shapes of a world separate from the ballroom, separate from the eyes that always watched, judged, whispered. Here, at last, there was privacy, and with it, the danger of truth. The Duchess stood near a heavy velvet drape, her fingers clutching the fabric as if it could anchor her to something steady while the storm within her threatened to overturn everything. The Duke was across the room, seated in a high-backed chair, coat loosened slightly at the collar, a rare concession to informality that made him appear almost vulnerable. His gaze, dark and inscrutable, followed her every movement, as though measuring her heart against some unseen scale of propriety and passion. "You should not have come here," he said finally, his voice low, edged with that peculiar mix of command and something more tender, a murmur meant not to be overheard. "And yet, you did." The Duchess drew a breath, one shivering and fragile, yet resolute. "I had to. There is much between us, unspoken, yet pressing, as though it cannot wait for polite society to dictate when we may speak." Her voice trembled, betraying the vulnerability she otherwise masked so carefully. She stepped closer, the soft rustle of her gown blending with the rhythm of the rain outside. "You leave me no guidance, and yet you demand compliance." The Duke rose, his figure looming in the firelight, shadowed yet undeniable. "Guidance?" he echoed, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I have offered it. You misread it, or perhaps you refuse to accept it. My actions, my attentions. You interpret them as cruelty, and yet they are the only honest truth I have given you." Her chest tightened. Honest truth. That phrase, so simple yet layered, struck her more sharply than any public humiliation. Could she truly believe it? Could the man who had so effortlessly shattered her dignity in front of society, who had twisted every glance and word into subtle torture, also be capable of sincerity? She struggled to reconcile the Duke she feared with the man whose voice now held a tremor of vulnerability. "You speak in riddles," she murmured, her voice barely above the rain's soft patter. "I am left to navigate your intentions, to wonder if you care at all for the woman I am beneath this costume of propriety." Her eyes, bright with unshed tears, held his in a gaze that demanded clarity. "Are you cruel, or merely cautious of what society would deem a scandal?" He stepped closer, closing the small distance between them, and for the first time, the Duchess felt the warmth of him not as a threat, but as a presence that could shelter and wound simultaneously. "I am cautious," he admitted, his voice dropping to a whisper that brushed against her ear, igniting a shiver she could not suppress. "Cautious of what the world sees, and cautious of the storm I might unleash upon you, were I to speak without restraint. There are passions in me, things you have yet to witness, and I am terrified of how they might consume us both." A tear escaped the Duchess, sliding silently down her cheek, unnoticed amid the shadows and flickering candlelight. She did not attempt to brush it away. Instead, she allowed herself, in that rare and dangerous intimacy, to feel the weight of longing that had pressed against her ribs since the ballroom, since the first misstep, since the Duke's subtle and merciless scrutiny. "And yet," she whispered, voice trembling with equal parts hope and fear, "I cannot help but long for that storm, if only to know that beneath all restraint, beneath all cruelty, there lies something real." He extended a gloved hand, hesitating for the merest heartbeat before she accepted it. The contact was electric, a collision of restraint and desire, of caution and recklessness. In the brief clasp of their hands, the room seemed to shrink, the world outside the library dissolved, and all that remained was the fragile intimacy of two hearts caught in the crossfire of social expectation and private yearning. "I have been a fool," he said, the words breaking free in a confession that carried more weight than any previous act of generosity or cruelty. "A fool to hide behind etiquette, to mask what I feel behind the armor of politeness and strategy. I see you, truly see you, and the fear that I might lose you to the world, to whispers, to appearances, has chained my tongue. But no more." The Duchess's breath caught. She dared not move, dared not speak, lest the fragile spell break. Every lesson she had learned about composure, about silence, about survival in this gilded cage, threatened to crumble beneath the raw vulnerability of his gaze. Yet, even as she absorbed his words, doubt lingered, a cautious, insistent shadow. Could she trust him? Could one man, so capable of orchestrating her public shame, also possess the courage to offer her the truth of his heart? I do not know if I can," she admitted softly, each word trembling like the first fragile petals of spring. "I do not know if your sincerity can outweigh the fear, the humiliation, the nights I have endured alone beneath the scrutiny of this merciless world." He stepped closer, tilting his head in a manner that was at once commanding and intimate. "Then let this night be the beginning," he said, his lips barely grazing her ear as he spoke, "the beginning of trust, of truth, of what might exist beyond appearances. I will not command you, nor will I demand your faith. Only, let me show you, in the ways I can, that beneath all the masks we wear, something real can exist between us." The Duchess's hand rose to rest upon his chest, feeling the steady beat of a heart that had been, until now, hidden behind layers of decorum and discipline. Her own heartbeat thundered in reply, a drum of fear, of longing, of the faintest spark of hope. "And if I falter," she whispered, the words barely audible over the rain and the crackle of the fire. "Then we falter together," he replied, a promise wrapped in a concession that was both frightening and exhilarating. "But know this, whatever the world sees, whatever scandal or whispers arise, I will not leave you to face it alone." The rain against the windows seemed to intensify, as though nature itself had taken note of their confession, tapping a rhythmic accompaniment to the fragile, trembling intimacy that now bound them. The Duchess closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to feel the strange, dangerous thrill of hope, tempered by the caution honed through years of societal survival. The storm outside mirrored the storm within, and for the first time since the ballroom, she felt herself not entirely powerless. A faint knock on the library door startled her, the sound sharp against the gentle patter of rain. She stepped back slightly, her pulse racing, realizing that the world outside, the world of eyes, of judgment, of unforgiving etiquette, was never far away. And yet, in that fleeting, suspended moment, she glimpsed a possibility that had been denied to her, that the Duke's heart, complex and enigmatic as it was, might offer her sanctuary from the cruel spectacle of appearances. And so they stood, the firelight dancing across their faces, shadows interlacing with the flicker of candle flames, two figures poised on the precipice of revelation and vulnerability. Outside, the rain continued its relentless patter, a quiet reminder that the world, with all its scrutiny and expectation, awaited. But inside, in the intimate warmth of the library, they had crossed an invisible threshold, a confession shared, a truth glimpsed, a fragile trust begun. And as the Duchess's fingers lingered upon the Duke's hand, a whisper of wind through the slightly ajar window carrying the scent of wet earth and roses, she knew with a sudden, piercing clarity that nothing in the gilded world of ballrooms or salons could undo the delicate, terrifying promise that had just been made, except, perhaps, the shadows of the Duke's own secrets, yet unseen, yet waiting. The ballroom had grown still, as though the very air had been held captive, waiting for the inevitable. Candles flickered across crystal chandeliers, throwing fractured light across the parquet floor, gilded mirrors, and the faces of the assembly, each expression carefully measured. The music had paused, leaving only the soft murmurs of speculation and the faint echo of whispered steps. The Duchess stood at the center, her gown of sapphire and silver shimmering beneath the chandeliers, her posture taut with the grace that society demanded of her. Yet beneath the surface, her heart trembled, a wild, fragile thing, caught between fear, longing, and anticipation. All eyes turned as the Duke entered from the raised dais, his presence commanding attention without effort. The hush that followed was tangible, as though the walls themselves had leaned in to witness. He moved with deliberate ease, each step measured, gloved hand brushing lightly against his coat, dark eyes scanning the room until they rested upon the Duchess. A faint tension rippled through the crowd. Some perceived a confrontation, others a subtle reconciliation. But the truth lay in neither. They were not there to perform for the audience, yet every move carried the weight of public scrutiny. The Duke halted a few paces before her, voice low, resonant, and carrying over the quiet hum of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, tone formal yet unyielding, "I fear that I have allowed appearances to dictate my conduct, and in doing so, I have wronged one who deserves far more than such cold regard." His gaze fixed upon the Duchess, the weight of each word carrying both confession and command. "To you, my Duchess, I offer not the hollow gestures of courtesy, nor the empty promises demanded by society, but the truth of my heart." A murmur coursed through the assembly. Whispers brushed against the walls, questioning, scandalized, intrigued. Yet the Duchess did not falter. She met his gaze, the sapphire of her eyes catching the flicker of the chandelier, the reflection of every intent, every longing, every unspoken word that had passed between them. She understood, with a clarity born of suffering and hope intertwined, that this was no longer merely a dance of appearances. This was a declaration, a moment of vulnerability and courage that would either unite or shatter them. He stepped closer, carefully navigating the distance between propriety and intimacy, his voice dropping to a tone meant solely for her ears, yet audible enough to send a shiver through those standing near. "I have been cruel, careless, and distant, and in that, I have allowed the world to shape our union rather than allowing us to shape it ourselves. But no more. If society demands judgment, let it come. If whispers wish to wound, let them. Tonight, I claim my truth, and I claim you, not as a trophy, not as a display, but as the woman who holds my heart." The Duchess felt a tremor pass through her, a ripple of warmth amidst the residual chill of public humiliation. She had known fear, she had endured shame, yet this proclamation, fierce and tender at once, stirred something long denied. The guests leaned forward, some with scandalized fascination, others with admiration, but she paid them no mind. The Duke's words had pierced the lattice of her apprehension, and in the gap left behind, she glimpsed the possibility of belonging, not to appearances, but to truth, to the raw, unvarnished intimacy of love unshielded by etiquette. Then, as though the universe itself conspired to heighten the drama, a small accident occurred. A maid dropped a tray of glasses, the delicate clink slicing through the silence. A ripple of distraction passed through the room, yet the Duke's hand reached for hers, steady, unwavering, anchoring her in that moment of suspended tension. "Do not falter," he whispered, and for the first time, the Duchess allowed herself to inhale fully, releasing the tight coil of fear that had gripped her since the ballroom had first witnessed her stumble. She lifted her hand, resting it upon his, fingers trembling yet deliberate. "And if the world condemns us?" she asked softly, each syllable a fragile admission of her hope and fear. "Then we will endure," he replied, voice resonant with conviction. "Together." His dark eyes, intense and unwavering, held her as if daring her to retreat, daring her to doubt. Yet she did not. The storm of whispers, the latticework of judgment, the constant scrutiny, they all faded into irrelevance beneath the gravity of the moment. A soft gasp passed through the crowd as he bent slightly, placing a single, deliberate kiss upon the back of her hand. It was a gesture at once public and private, scandalous and tender, commanding and reverent. The Duchess felt her pulse quicken, her chest lift, her soul teeter between the lingering fear of betrayal and the exhilarating possibility of redemption. This act, so simple in its execution, shattered the remnants of humiliation and replaced them with the first fragile sparks of trust. Some of the guests stiffened. Propriety demanded disapproval, yet fascination glimmered in every eye. The orchestra, sensing the moment's culmination, began a soft, anticipatory melody, strings trembling with emotion that mirrored the intensity of the scene. The Duchess and the Duke, hand in hand, allowed themselves a brief moment of shared space, a quiet acknowledgement that, despite appearances, they had crossed the boundary between spectacle and reality. Then, as if to punctuate the emotional crescendo, the Duke's voice rose slightly, carrying across the room with the weight of certainty. "Let this night mark a beginning," he declared. A beginning of honesty, of courage, of love that will not bow to whispers or society's rigid expectations. I pledge to you, openly and irrevocably, that my heart and my fidelity are yours alone. Tears glimmered in the Duchess's eyes, a mixture of relief, awe, and a fragile triumph over the lingering shadows of shame. She allowed herself a small nod, the faintest quiver of a smile playing across her lips. She had endured ridicule, she had weathered humiliation, yet here, at this precise intersection of courage and revelation, she felt the first true stirrings of hope. A hush settled, the room holding its collective breath, and in that silence, a subtle understanding passed between them. Appearances would continue to demand attention, whispers would persist, and society would always watch with sharp eyes. Yet within this fleeting, stolen space of shared conviction, they had established a truth stronger than judgment, more enduring than scandal. And as the orchestra swelled, carrying a melody of tender triumph through the chamber, the Duchess felt herself rise, not merely in stature, but in spirit. She had survived the cruelty of appearances. She had glimpsed the depth of a man whose capacity for both torment and devotion had left her breathless, and she understood, with an unwavering clarity, that the journey was far from over, yet already transformed. The Duke's gaze held hers, steady, unwavering, a tether through which the world's chaos could not intrude. He offered a subtle bow, almost ceremonial, almost playful, and yet beneath the gesture lay the unspoken promise of protection, intimacy, and unyielding commitment. The Duchess, for the first time in countless hours of scrutiny and suffering, allowed herself to believe in the possibility of redemption, not merely for her reputation, but for her heart. And just as the first tentative notes of the waltz resumed, she felt the faintest brush of his lips near her ear, a whisper meant only for her. "Tonight, the world can say what it will. But know this, my Duchess. You are mine, and I am yours, whatever storms may follow." The room seemed to exhale, the chandeliers flickering as if in applause, the mirrors reflecting the brilliance of a revelation both public and intimately shared. And for the first time since she had entered this gilded cage, the Duchess understood that she had reclaimed her dignity, her agency, and, in the arms of the man who had once brought her shame, the fragile, trembling promise of true love. Yet in that victory, beneath the layers of triumph and tenderness, lingered the shadow of all that remained unseen, the secrets, the fears, the challenges that would inevitably rise between them. And in that quiet, electric uncertainty, the Duchess's heart both trembled and soared, aware that the story was only beginning, and that the next choice, the next revelation, would demand everything she had learned, and perhaps more. The night had descended fully, yet the glow of chandeliers and firelight transformed the ballroom into a kingdom of suspended brilliance. Every surface, gilded mirrors, polished floors, crystal ornaments, reflected not merely light but the weight of society's gaze, poised as both judge and witness. The Duchess stood near the center, her gown a cascade of midnight blue silk, embroidered in silver threads that shimmered with every subtle movement. Her pulse was steady, but her breath caught in anticipation. The events of the evening had sharpened her awareness to the precariousness of appearances, the fragility of trust, and the enduring power of desire. The Duke appeared at the raised dais once more, a figure of impeccable composure, yet tonight there was a shift in him, subtle but undeniable. The stern angle of his jaw had softened, and the shadowed intensity in his eyes now carried an unspoken urgency. He moved toward her not with ceremony but with purpose, the orchestra having fallen silent at the crescendo of his attention. Every eye followed his steps, every whisper seeking meaning in his approach, yet no one could read the truth that lay beneath the surface, an intensity that demanded courage, vulnerability, and surrender. "Tonight," he began, his voice low but carrying across the hushed assembly, "is not merely an evening of spectacle, nor a performance of etiquette and appearances. Tonight is a reckoning." His gaze met hers, unwavering, and the words were more than declaration. They were a summons, a challenge, and a confession all at once. The Duchess felt the familiar tremor of fear, tinged now with something far more compelling, the thrill of possibility, the tension of stakes finally revealed. A hush fell over the room, the audience sensing the gravity without understanding its full measure. The Duke took her hand, gloved and trembling only slightly, and lifted it to his lips. The gesture was formal yet intimate, ceremonial yet charged with unspoken desire. "I have wronged you, not only in public but in the private chambers of your heart," he confessed, each word deliberate, weighted with sincerity. "And I have allowed pride, appearances, and the fear of scandal to dictate my actions where passion, devotion, and truth should have prevailed. The Duchess's eyes glistened, her fingers brushing his, feeling the warmth of his hand beneath her own, a tether in the storm of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. I have suffered," she whispered, voice quivering yet steadying. "Yet I have not ceased to hope. And hope is the most dangerous companion when so much hangs upon the judgment of others." Her gaze swept across the room, noting the subtle shifts in expression, the silent question marks that hung in the air like a gauzy veil. Yet she did not falter. Her dignity, honed through humiliation and trial, remained intact even as her heart surged with newfound courage. The Duke drew her closer, bridging the last inches between formality and intimacy, and for a moment the world contracted to the space they occupied. "Then let the judgment of the world fall where it may," he said, a faint quiver in his voice betraying the depth of feeling he had long concealed. "It matters little what whispers may arise, what eyes may pry. What matters is this moment, this truth, and the bond one offer you, beyond scrutiny, beyond scandal, beyond the fragile confines of expectation." A tremor ran through the Duchess, a shiver that began in her fingertips and raced to her chest. The storm of past shame, of whispered derision, of every carefully orchestrated slight, seemed to dissolve in the intensity of his confession. Her lips parted slightly, the first breath of release since the opening humiliation. "And if I accept?" she asked, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "If I surrender not to appearances but to the truth you offer?" "Then," he said, drawing her into the soft curve of his arm, "we step into the world not as pawns of society, but as two hearts that choose one another, regardless of the cost." His eyes, dark and commanding, held hers with unyielding focus, compelling her to trust, to hope, to believe. No veil of scandal, no ripple of gossip, no lingering shadow of humiliation shall divide us. I swear it. The orchestra resumed at that precise instant, a gentle swell of strings and woodwinds that seemed to breathe life into the scene. The Duchess felt herself carried on the rhythm, lifted not merely by music but by the tide of courage rising within her. Each note reflected the crescendo of her own heart, the subtle harmony between desire and dignity, between fear and liberation. She allowed herself to lean slightly into his presence, their hands entwined, their eyes locked, and in that fusion of trust and longing, the ballroom became both stage and sanctuary. Yet, even as triumph surged within her, there remained a thread of peril, the delicate reminder that the world outside this moment was unyielding. A rustle near the gallery. A servant, a jealous matron, an envious peer, threatened to intrude, to remind them of the fragile lattice of appearances upon which their lives rested. The Duchess did not flinch. She had learned to navigate these storms, to withstand judgment and to reclaim her agency amid the currents of scrutiny. She lifted her chin, heart steady now, acknowledging both the danger and the thrill of what she had achieved. The Duke bent slightly, pressing a brief, deliberate kiss to the top of her hand, a gesture at once public and private, daring yet reverent. The effect was electric, a visible charge that caused a subtle murmur to ripple through the assembly. Yet even as eyes turned, even as speculation rose, the Duchess felt a liberation she had never known, a reclamation of self, of heart, and of choice. This was her victory, hard-won and shimmering, as delicate and radiant as the sapphire of her gown. "Together," he murmured again, his lips brushing the side of her wrist. "We endure. We rise. And whatever storms the world may conjure, we face them as one." The words, simple yet profound, resonated in the Duchess's chest, filling the hollow spaces left by prior humiliation. She understood that love, in its truest form, was neither quiet nor hidden. It was a declaration, a stand, a confrontation with the world that demanded courage above all else. The Duchess raised her eyes to the assembly, acknowledging without word or gesture that she had been seen, not merely as ornament or victim, but as a woman of choice, of agency, and of unshakable dignity. The Duke mirrored her resolve, a silent covenant passing between them that no whisper, no scandal, no shadow could undo. The air seemed to shimmer with this shared understanding, attention released, transformed into brilliance, like sunlight scattering through fractured crystal. Then, as if nature itself approved of the union forged in courage and revelation, a sudden gust of wind burst through the slightly ajar windows, rustling the velvet drapes and carrying the scent of rain and wet earth. The chandeliers swayed faintly, casting a cascade of fractured light across their faces. It was a final reminder that the world remained alive and unpredictable, yet for the first time, the Duchess felt fully anchored within it, not by appearances, not by duty, but by love and choice. He drew her gently into a waltz, a slow, deliberate turn that felt less a dance of society and more a private celebration, their movements in perfect, intimate harmony. With each step, each careful glide, each lift and pivot, they claimed their space, their bond, their triumph over both fear and shame. The assembly watched, silent now, captivated by the undeniable force of the moment. A spectacle, yes, but one of heart and courage rather than mere etiquette. The Duchess allowed herself to rest her head briefly against his shoulder, closing her eyes to the brilliance of the chandeliers, the weight of the past, and the uncertainty of the future. And in that brief, stolen instant, she understood the depth of the journey they had undertaken together. The humiliation endured, the confessions shared, the trust earned, and now, this reclamation of love. She had survived the cruelty of appearances, she had glimpsed the sincerity behind the Duke's enigmatic demeanor, and she had stepped into a space where passion and propriety could coexist. Not perfectly, but beautifully, irreversibly, and irrevocably. As the waltz carried them through the final measures, the Duke's whisper, warm against her ear, sealed the truth of the night. We are ours, beyond the eyes of the world, beyond its whispers, beyond its judgment. Nothing can undo what has begun here. The Duchess opened her eyes, meeting his gaze, and for the first time since her marriage, she allowed herself to believe that love could triumph, not only over shame, but over the very world that had once sought to dictate the limits of her heart. And as the music faded into silence, the chandeliers casting their last glittering reflections, the ballroom seemed to exhale, the echo of triumph lingering like the afterglow of a storm. Outside, the rain had ceased, leaving a world cleansed, shimmering, and full of possibility. And within the Duke's embrace, the Duchess understood a truth deeper than any whispered rumor or perfumed gesture of society. That love, when chosen and declared, could survive cruelty, endure scandal, and endure the relentless scrutiny of the world. And yet, in the fragile quiet after their victory, a single truth remained, pulsing like the last note of a waltz, that the heart's journey was never truly over, and that the choices made tonight would echo in every glance, every gesture, every whispered word to come, binding them together irrevocably for all the days that lay ahead.